Good afternoon, and welcome to the Debut Spotlight. My name is Ellen Comisar, and I am delighted today to introduce Blaze Nation to Julia R. Kelly, who is joining us from the UK to discuss her marvelous new book, The Fisherman's Gift. Welcome, Julia.
Hi, thank you very much for inviting me.
We're very happy to have you. The Fisherman's Gift was published last week in the US and earlier this month in the UK. It will soon be available internationally, and the folks at Simon & Schuster and elsewhere must be thrilled. Let me just give a bit of an introduction on who we are at A Mighty Blaze, and then we'll dive right in and talk about Julia and her wonderful book. A Mighty Blaze was founded at the beginning of COVID with the idea that we needed to continue to connect authors to readers and readers to books. And we are now 5 years strong. We are going strong. Fortunately, COVID is no longer quite the threat it was, but we have found our audience, and we are going to continue as long as we can to do what we do best, which is talk about books and talk to authors. We are an all-volunteer group of about 30 creative professionals or professional creatives, however you want to call us. We have a website, www.amightyblaze.com, which will give you all sorts of information about our shows. And you can also sign up for our newsletter, which arrives by email and will give you all the scheduling information so you don't miss any of our terrific programming. We are also ubiquitous on social media. We are on Facebook. We are on X, which I rarely call X. I usually call Twitter and love it as Twitter. We are on Instagram and now on TikTok as well. So please look for us, follow us, share us with your friends. This is the place to get lit. All right, so Julia R. Kelly's first book is wonderful. It's called The Fisherman's Gift, and we've seen a zillion great reviews, and I can vouch for it myself. The New York Journal of Books says, Julia depicts the nature of grief astutely. She skillfully delineates characters and has an expertly woven plot, an engrossing story that will lift your spirit. Publishers Weekly talks about Julia's ability to plumb the human desire for connection with a gentle and skillful hand. Christina Baker Klein, you know her from The Orphan Train and The Exiles, calls the book a poignant, spellbinding tale of loss and resilience. It has been called hauntingly beautiful, completely absorbing, breathtaking, exquisitely written, pitch perfect, and Julia has been described by Adriana Trigiani as a gift to readers everywhere. So clearly we have a lot of big name authors, a lot of past Blaze guests who are very excited about this book, as am I. Let me give you a brief bio on Julia, and then we will dive right in with our discussion. Julia Kelly has been longlisted for the Dyslexia Novel Prize, the Exeter Novel Prize, Penguin Right Now, and the Bath Novel Award. In 2021, she won the Blue Pencil First Novel Award. She has grown up in a house without television, so she read everything she could lay her hands on. And as an English teacher, she has tried to pass on her love of stories to the next generation of readers and writers. She lives in Herefordshire with her partner, and between them, they have raised 5 wonderful children. And as mentioned before, The Fisherman's Gift is her debut novel. So welcome, Julia.
Hi, thank you very much for that introduction. It's very flattering.
Well, and we're very well deserved. So I'd love for you to give a very short little description of the main idea behind The Fisherman's Gift.
Well, the story opens in 1900 in a small fishing village in Scotland called Skerry, in a storm, and a small child, a young boy, washes up on the beach in the storm, and he bears an uncanny resemblance to Dorothy's son. Dorothy's a local teacher, not from the area, but who's moved there previously, and whose own son was actually lost in a storm himself many years before. And it falls to Dorothy to look after the boy while the village try to discover where he's come from and to return him to his home. But actually, the boy's arrival becomes a catalyst for the secrets and lies in the village to kind of surface, and also for Dorothy to face her own past and her grief for her own son, as her kind of yearning to be reunited with him starts to blur the boundaries between reality and what she desperately hopes for, which is that it's her son come back to her. So that's the kind of premise of the story.
And while you might think it has great religious overtones of, sort of this resurrection, and it's really much more sort of set in sort of almost a folklore of, children returning from the sea and children bouncing around in the sea and calling to people on land to come join them in the sea, which I found really interesting.
Okay, yeah. I really wanted to try to depict, and I know it takes different forms in different sort of periods of human time, but the novel obviously is set in the 1900s, but it's a dual timeline story. So we also have the earlier period when Dorothy first arrives in Skerry, which is about 20 years before, something like that. And of course, at that time, particularly in really small communities, superstition and folklore is has a very, very strong presence. And I think, often when you're faced with the harsh realities of life and death, we often seek to kind of explain those things through, these kind of legends and myths that spring up around places and around people. So I wanted to try to depict the way the village was facing often, the really harsh realities of a fishing community where, people were lost at sea on quite a regular basis, particularly that, the North Sea is quite, very, very dangerous in the north of Scotland. And, but at the same time, they're also seeking to explain some of those things, perhaps in a way that may seem comforting by, I suppose, I hesitate to use the word supernatural, but I guess that's what I mean in those sort of folkloric terms, like changeling myths. If you have a child that's ailing, maybe it's because the fairies swapped it. It's a way of us trying to understand and make sense of the things that happen to us. So I wanted to try and show both of those things, the kind of harsh reality, but also that kind of folkloric context as well for that small community.
You do a great job of evoking the small village and the time period, both in terms of language and some of the holiday customs. Was that something you did a lot of research into? Were you familiar with it before you started writing the book? How did that all come about?
No, it was difficult because actually I'm a wheelchair user, and I can't get out and about. So doing the research was almost solely through the internet, which was just such a huge gift. So there were just so many things to try and learn about how people might have lived. And it was a bit like quilting, because I felt like I would, get this little snapshot maybe from a video on YouTube from years and years and years ago of a fisherman with lobster creels, or somebody who had made a little video a long, long time ago of a tiny little Scottish fishing village, old photographs of grocery shops, and I'd be zooming in trying to see what's in the window, what brands, as well as museum sites. Inevitably, Wikipedia was a really, really good kind of starting point for me. But, and then I would try and find, perhaps more detailed sources for things.
Or more legitimate ones.
Yeah, well, quite. I was absolutely, and to kind of fact check everything. And what was always a little bit of a worry is that because each thing was a snapshot, I couldn't be certain, of course, if by sewing it all together, I was giving a realistic picture. I mean, I did my absolute best to check everything that I was trying to depict. But of course, the amount of research that you do, only a little bit of it ever appears in the book. So it's a bit like an iceberg, and it's just the tip of the iceberg in the book, because obviously people don't want to be bogged down with loads of detail, but it does need to be confident, and it does need to be as authentic as you can, try to make it. So I loved all that. I love history, and I loved the research element of it, actually.
Yes, I mean, oftentimes, and especially with a lot of debut novels, the criticism is, well, your research was showing. And in this case, there was a confidence, oh, she knows this, she's got this down. And you could really picture the village, and you could imagine, both the seaside and the seascape, which was, treacherous and beautiful, but also this little town where everybody is on top of each other. Everybody seems to know everyone's business, except in the ways that they don't. And I think that was one of the really interesting things to me. We have Dorothy, who arrives to be a school teacher in a very small school with children who have very little interest in learning. And she is the quintessential outsider. And also in part because of her nature, doesn't really blend in. And I was fascinated by, in particular, the women in Mrs. Brown's store, the daily shoppers, who functioned in a way like a Greek choir, a Greek chorus. They were in the background. Every time she was in the scene, they got quiet and observed or looked at her in snide ways. And as soon as she left, they started chit-chatting about her. Was that something either from a literary standpoint that you thought about, or was that just sort of a way to portray the village and what the women were like?
I think one of the things, and I sometimes wonder if I succeeded in sort of pulling this off really, but the women in the shop, they're gossipers. I mean, they're gossiping.
Oh yeah.
But actually they're not terribly unkind. They seem it, but they're all sharing like women do. And we've been, derogated and criticized for it all through the ages. The fact that we talk a lot, but actually it's our complete saving grace. I mean, I know that with my friends, we have laughed and cried our way through all the traumas of our lives and the successes. And that's one of the ways that we have of kind of surviving and coping, is just to talk it all out. And Dorothy doesn't let herself be a part of that. So even when when she first encounters them, when she first comes to Skerry, and she feels like they're mocking her, and is it mocking or is it just teasing, but she feels very much on the outside and very wary of them because of her own background with this very critical mother, and she's internalized this kind of criticism. So I think I did want to convey what small community life is like, and, where you sneeze with your curtains drawn and you go out the next day and somebody asks how your cold is. We all know each other's business. But as you said, and I love the way you put that, apart from the fact that they don't, and that's one of the things, Dorothy won't communicate. She won't participate in sharing, her life with the other women. So actually that's one of the reasons she becomes so kind of isolated and suffers so much. And I try to redeem that at some point with Mrs. Brown anyway.
Yes.
And I've actually forgotten what your question was, so I don't know if I answered it.
Absolutely. We're just having a great chat. I noticed, and as you answered, that in many ways, Dorothy is a little bit more like many of the men in the story, in that they keep to themselves for the most part, and don't really share. And they all similarly, I mean, all of the characters, as all people do, have, their public persona and then all their private lives and thoughts. And it's just very interesting that ultimately Dorothy in some ways connects with some other men who are quiet and not necessarily the guys who go to the bar and hang out, and they're pretty isolated themselves. And that was I mean, I wonder if that was intentional to make her that way or make her like them.
Do you know, I never really thought of it that way. I did feel the kind of polarity between, you know, the gossipy women and the men. And I guess in that, you know, what we know now and hopefully is changing, that kind of cultural conditioning where men, you know, have not been encouraged to share their feelings. And we all know the problems that can generate for individuals, you know, not to share. So I never actually kind of made the connection that Dorothy is more like them and actually chooses men that are like that. But I saw her as well as a kind of victim, although, you know, she's also an awkward and prickly person. But I also saw her as that kind of victim of being somebody who can't willingly share her story, because really it's, you know, the women in the shop, they're all sharing the stories of their lives. And, you know, and life is so much better if we do communicate and we do share. And the people that suffer the most in the story really are the ones that keep it all inside and don't discover that, in fact, you know, they're just like everybody else. And that, you know, particularly the mothers, you know, for Dorothy being a mother, if she'd just ever spoken about that, everybody, motherhood's difficult for everybody, you know, and yet she punishes herself because she doesn't ever talk to anybody about it. So that was something, that was a very conscious theme in the book, really, was, yeah, not sharing the kind of trials of motherhood, like the women in the shop. You know, we can assume that's what they've been doing for years, all through their lives, is sharing all of those things, you know, the troubles with marriage, the troubles with parenthood.
As my father told me on one very difficult day with my children, did you ever hear me say parenting is easy?
It really, really isn't.
But you don't know, and you don't know. And you talk a lot in the book. There's a lot of introspection and among the characters, in particular about Dorothy, about what kind of mother she is. Did she do enough? Did she, you know, why couldn't she keep her child safe? And it was really interesting because the book is told, some of the stories are told repeatedly from different points of view. And you hear echoes of those same themes of, you know, am I a good parent? Am I a good person? Is my life, is this what I thought life would be like? And I think it's fascinating how you were able to portray that. You know, you had Agnes, you had Joseph, you had William, you had all these different people, Jane, all the William, her husband's sister. You had all these different people whose voices come through in their own, both in their own chapters, but also in the chapters by others when they talk about them. Can you talk a little bit about that kaleidoscope approach, that let's look at this from all sides?
Yeah, I loved what you said about, you know, Greek chorus, and I love that term kaleidoscope, because that was really how I wanted the story to be told, just through lots of different voices, like a kind of tapestry, you know, where it all weaves together to create the whole story. But also so that we could glimpse people from other people's point of view, so that we didn't just find out what Dorothy's like from what Dorothy says, but also from how other people perceive her, so that everybody is seen through everybody else's eyes, as well as their own kind of interior lives. And what I hoped to achieve sometimes with that is that people that sometimes seemed really difficult and were really difficult, like Dorothy, there might be moments as well when we could glimpse, by seeing her from somebody else's point of view, maybe view her a little bit more compassionately, or understand that she's really struggling, or maybe see that the women, or like Mrs. Brown, isn't actually being unkind. A lot of the time she's trying to tell Dorothy something, you know. So when Dorothy's going to look after the boy and she says, "Are you prepared?" And Dorothy thinks she means, have I got enough soap and have I got enough flour for bread? But actually what Mrs. Brown means is, you lost a child and now you're about to take in another child into your home. Are you prepared for how hard this is going to be for you? So, yeah, I wanted that kaleidoscope approach so that we could build up a kind of more rounded sort of 360 image, if you like, of each of the characters, although it's quite fragmented as well because, a lot of the chapters are quite short and we're getting kind of glimpses. But also, I wanted to do that way just because that's what village life is like. It's what small community life is like, where it is a community. It's a little beehive buzzing away, So I tried to kind of reflect that as well.
I think you did a beautiful job on that.
Thank you.
One of the things that because the chapters are told by all these different people, but also we're dealing both with the present, which is the now of the book, which is Dorothy's taking in this child who has been injured and is at first not at all communicative, and they don't know if this child has been hurt or what the status of this child is. And then what was called the then period, which mirrors it, was sort of this fluidity of both time and memory, and how these things that were either remembered and buried, or in some cases not even remembered, would resurface, later in life as Dorothy encounters this boy, as the community sort of revisits what certainly must have been one of the big crises in their recent history. Was that a complicated thing to do, to sort of shift back and forth and look at memory and look at time that way?
Yes, it really, really was. And I didn't write the book because it's dual timeline. I couldn't write it in a linear way. I couldn't just begin at page 1 and then end, at page 300 and whatever. I had to, in some ways it was quite nice because it meant when I sat down to write and I had no idea what I was going to write and was terrified of what was going to happen in that writing session, I had quite a lot to choose from because I had this cast of characters and I had 2 different timelines, so I could sort of dip in and out. But the real challenge came in trying to interweave those, because there were multiple characters and the 2 timelines. It's lovely to hear what you've just said, because I knew that there was a very big risk, that sometimes when you read a dual timeline book and then it switches to the other timeline, you think, oh no, I was liking that a bit and I don't really like this timeline. And also trying to sort of end chapters on hopefully enticing moments, but then that had some kind of meaningful link with the next chapter that might be in the past. I actually ended up with a kind of table I made, a sort of graph, where, it's inscrutable to me now. I sometimes look at this graph, it makes absolutely no sense at all. But at the time, it was me trying to figure, right, that chapter needs to come here and it needs to be followed by this voice in the past. And I found that incredibly complicated and had to have quite a few goes at sort of shifting, the way the tapestry was woven together, if you like. So yeah, I did find that very complicated.
I imagine there was a lot of shuffling of the deck, as it were,
yes,
of moving those sections front and back, because there is, in the telling, obviously, there's also got to be a narrative pull. There has to be something that's pulling us forward and revealing things or hinting at revelations from different characters at different times. So did you have a character that you loved writing more than the others?
I did. It's funny because they never really felt like characters I'd made up. When I first thought of the story, I didn't kind of think of it. It was odd. It just kind of landed in my head one morning during COVID, actually, during the very first lockdown in the UK. and I was about to meet some friends, on Zoom. It was all quite a new thing. And I've got writing friends, I'm in a writing group, and we used to meet for coffee mornings. And this story just kind of landed in my head. And I mean, I suppose the characters I liked writing most, and I liked writing all of them, if I'm honest, but I loved writing Mrs. Brown because I found her so enigmatic.
Mm-hmm.
And she's the only person we don't know what her first name is even. And I kind of wanted to try and keep her at arm's length, but I also loved, from me, so that we don't actually see lots and lots of her and her life and her background. But yet she seems to, because she's, the shop is the heart of the village. Everybody has to go there for everything that they need. And I loved this idea that she kind of knew everything about everybody else, almost in a slightly spooky way. She was a bit of a seer. But then nobody, particularly Dorothy, doesn't really know anything about her. And we don't really know anything about her. But I did really, really love writing Moses. He's actually doesn't appear, Dorothy's own son. And he doesn't appear in lots and lots of scenes, but I did really love writing him. It was like I could sort of see him and feel him. And I felt so tender towards this sort of quiet child that I think, I really did enjoy writing the few scenes that he's in, actually.
I love that he was named Moses, just from a biblical standpoint of, the child who gets placed in the water and who in Bible stories, lives on and doesn't get lost in the water. And so that sort of imagery of, could this found boy, we're carried along with that in some ways. We're, on the one hand, we know, okay, this can't be the same boy at the same age 5 years later, but boy, there's a lot going on here. And, so there is sort of that magical and, just sort of that connectivity. And there was also, I thought, when Moses is born, he has a cowl, a skin kind of thing over his head, which is similar. Barbara Kingsolver has that in Demon Copperhead.
Yes, she does.
Which is sort of fascinating. And I don't remember if it was in Dickens as well with David Copperfield.
I don't remember. To my shame, I don't know. I don't think I've read David Copperfield. I adored Demon Copperhead. I could not stop reading that book. It was like putting your toe in a river and then just suddenly falling in and just being swept until the end. It was one of those books that, because I'm in the wheelchair, I think everywhere I went, it was just on my lap, so that I could just keep reading it.
And so the mythology, again, going back to folklore, is that if your child is born that way, on the one hand, it's a little scary, both for the midwives and the mother, and they're sort of freaked out. But there was this mythology that a child thus born cannot drown.
Yeah, there's lots of different sort of folklore attached to being born with the caul, because there's being born in the actual amniotic sac, and then but the caul is just when the waters have broken, but you've got the actual membrane still attached to the child. And and I think there are changeling myths attached to it. But then also, yes, I came across this one that was so kind of perfect for the story, which is that there was this idea that you could rub it off with paper, but then you could keep the paper as a talisman to protect the child from drowning. And not only that, but you could, some people sold these as well, maybe to sailors or fishermen, or as kind of protective, as a protective talisman against drowning, which of course was kind of perfect for Dorothy, who eschews that kind of folklore. She's from Edinburgh, she's got a bit of education, what a lot of nonsense. So she doesn't want anything to do with that when the midwives say, well, do you want to keep it? But then, of course, like we all do as mothers, she blames herself. She can't help wondering, alongside all the other things that she blames herself for, should I have kept it?
Mm-hmm.
Would
Right.
I have protected my son better?
Right. It's yeah, that was a fascinating connection, especially since for so many readers, Demon Copperhead is, front and center, and that's very much at the beginning of the book, and it's very much thematic there as well. So it was a nice connection to see in this book. In terms of a lot of the language and sort of the historical terms, was that also something that was super researched on your part? Are you, there's a lot of specific terminology. That the reader understands intuitively. It's all in context, you get it. But how did that come in, and how did you decide how much to use and where to just use standard British English?
Yeah, I think, I actually bought this incredible book that I think was published by a university over here, and it was somebody's, research into what, people would have called certain things all along the northeastern coast of, Northumbria here, which is just south of Scotland, but then also up the Scottish coast. So that was just this amazing resource to find. And of course, again, the internet is just so fantastic for that. I know obviously we're very aware of the pitfalls of the internet and verifying information, but without a doubt, where research is concerned, it's a fascinating and huge resource. So yeah, I tried to, as far as I could, reflect those things. I've got some Scottish friends. My partner's actually Scottish. And I'm sure I got a lot wrong. And one of the things that I did decide very much that I didn't want to do was to attempt, in the way the women speak, for instance, kind of a Scottish dialectical form with punctuation or things like that, because I'm not Scottish myself. And I just think there's then an expectation that the whole book has to then really reflect that Scottish historical culture, and I did not feel qualified to do that. So I tried to make sure that where absolutely relevant, I was using words of the time from the region, but that, when the women are speaking to each other, I did stop at, trying to represent that kind of dialect in speech.
It can often be off-putting because if you don't hear it, you end up having to vocalize in your head, which as a reader, theoretically, you're not supposed to be doing. So it can sort of be a distancing aspect.
I think it can. I also think that unless the whole book is written like colloquially, so you've got somebody like Irvine Walsh, writing Train Spotting, all in Scottish, he's Scottish and he wrote it in his language and his dialect. And, it was utterly immersive. Once I could hear the rhythms of it in my head, I found that utterly immersive. Well, I couldn't possibly reproduce something like that. And it would have felt a little bit inauthentic to then try and represent it in the dialogue, So I just thought, well, no, I'm not going to attempt that because I just think I'll get it all wrong. And, and then that'd be an issue. But yeah, I tried to, there were things, the names of flowers and boats and food and things like that obviously I wanted to get right.
So I'd love for you to hold up a copy of your book, The Fisherman's Gift. If you're just joining us, we're talking to Julia R. Kelly, and she's got both a magnificent book and a magnificently illustrated cover, and a marvelous book. I want to just talk to you a little bit. You mentioned earlier your process of, sitting down and not knowing where to start and what to pick, whether it was a certain character or a certain time period. Can you talk a little bit about your writing process, your writing day, how it works?
Well, things have changed a lot because obviously, as you said in the introduction, I used to be a teacher and I started writing this in 2020. but we had lockdown, but I was still teaching from home, and also, struggling with worsening health, worsening disability. So I was exhausted, but I really believed in this story. Like, as I said, it kind of dropped into my head, and I always felt actually, I haven't written the best book in the world. What would be the chances that I've written the best book that was ever written? But for me, I felt like it had been gifted to me almost, this story of this little village. And I felt like they really existed, and they let me in for a little bit. And then at the end, they were like, that's enough. Let us get on with it, our lives now. But writing it, trying to get that on the page when I was teaching and unwell, and I had some of the children at home, was incredibly challenging. And I don't think I could have done it without my writing group. So at night time, after I'd finished my marking and finished, my school prep, we would log into Zoom, and we had writing sprints, and we used the Pomodoro method, where you work for 25 minutes and then you have a little break, and would say, how did you get on? And what are you going to do for the next 25 minutes? And I did that for about 2 years, 3 years to get the book written. But once, I think this is anybody involved in anything creative will say this, that once you find that kind of flow state, it is the best feeling in the world. But until you find that flow state, it's pretty terrifying.
Yes.
Because you're looking at a blank screen, and wondering how you're going to make headway. And I think the thing that I really tried to remember is that it's okay if what you write initially isn't great, because you can go back and you can edit it. And often, if you don't start very well, you can surprise yourself, 10 minutes in, it's that's what I want to say today. This is what Dorothy's doing, or this is what I want to show about Moses. But you don't always know that when you sit down. Having said that, I did know the ending of the story. I know lots of writers can trust to the process and begin writing, and plot will unfold. But I'm not like that at all. I need to know where the story's going, so that I know always that's the destination. This is the emotional payoff for the characters and the reader that I want to try to build up to. But things are different now because I've retired, so I have much more. It's not so exhausting, and I can do it whenever I like.
That's good.
So,
got a couple questions from me, and then I hope we can open it up to questions from our audience. So if you have them, please put them in our chat. We'll be getting to them shortly. Are there any of the characters in the book that sort of you found yourself surprised to introduce? Like, was there a character that came into the book midway through that hadn't existed?
Yes, Agnes.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, Agnes hadn't. She was kind of there, but she was it was not even a cameo role, really. Initially, she was just somebody that Dorothy knows or discovers has a connection with Joseph,
right,
who obviously Dorothy, has develops feelings for, which isn't giving away any big spoilers. And then suddenly she just kind of, and it probably was about halfway through, actually, I think she just suddenly, developed into this more present, rounded character who has a kind of opposite problem, or a different problem where children are concerned, to Dorothy. And becomes in some ways Dorothy's antagonist in the novel, although of course when you discover everybody's stories, nobody is really an antagonist, as you said right at the beginning. It's just that some of the stories the women know about each other, and some of them they don't. Right. And as those unfold, hopefully for the reader, we develop compassion for everybody, even when they perhaps behaved badly. So yeah, I think Agnes, I didn't see Agnes coming. and I did really care for her.
I think it was very interesting because this idea of, there's a line about kindness sort of toward the end of the book. I don't have it, the exact words, but that kindness is everything. And ultimately, we're able to look at almost all of the characters with a degree of kindness, which you don't at the outset think you're going to have for everybody.
Mm.
And what was striking is that so much of it was done with very sort of sparse language, in the sense of, and this few of the reviews I read, that it was just very tight sentences, there's not a lot of description. We know a little bit about what they're wearing, but I couldn't pick out any of these characters were I to meet them on the streets in scary Scotland. And so it was an interesting way to sort of come at these people much more about their interior life than how they physically presented themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's really nice to hear that you felt kindness towards people that you didn't think you would, because I did really want it ultimately, because, sometimes I read reviews. I mean, sometimes I try not to, but I've been lucky, actually. In general, I've had nice, people make nice comments. I find it really interesting what people pick out from the story as well, to comment on. And, I am aware, weirdly, much more now than when I was writing it, that in many ways it is a really sad story, and lots of sad and difficult things happen. But ultimately, I did want it to end on a note of, hope, with the possibility of redemption, even for the kind of the worst people in the novel. I wanted everybody to have that, hopefully, beyond the ending of the novel, in the kind of life that I wasn't allowed to witness any further of the village, that everybody got to have their second chance, hopefully.
Speaking of second chances, what is next on your writing career? What are you working on?
Well, I'm writing book 2 now, which is set about 30 years before The Fisherman's Gift. It is also set by the sea, but in a very different place. It's a kind of Victorian holiday town with pier and merry-go-round, and I actually haven't prepared any kind of blurby thing or little pitch that I could say, and I'm terrified of giving
That's
away
okay.
the main twist. But yeah, I'm writing that now, and hopefully that will be published in 2027.
Something to look forward to.
Thank you.
Can we put up some audience questions, please? What writing advice would you give to your younger self?
Oh, writing is frightening. I imagine it is any kind of creative endeavor where it's so exposing, and I think I was, I've always been an avid reader, as you said in your introduction. I grew up without television and I hated that. But now, retrospectively, I'm really grateful for it. We lived in a house full of books, and I've always been an avid reader, and same for my sisters. And but I was kind of terrified of writing. I always wanted to write. I wrote the most awful poetry, but I was scared of being no good at it. And of course, life gets in the way as well, jobs and children and all the things that life throws at us. And I think my advice to anybody and to my younger self would be, feel the fear and do it anyway. The only way you find your voice is by writing. And a very lovely friend of mine said, you will not solve the problem of writing and of how you write by just anticipating it. You've got to start somewhere. And sometimes it's a bit like weeding. What you'll write won't be great. You're getting rid of all the kind of the dross, and then eventually your voice will come through. And I just wish that I'd realized that a long time ago.
So many of us have imposter syndrome. It's like we know
Yes.
we've read great books, we know we can write good sentences, we might have a great idea, and then you say, "Oh, I don't know." So I love this feel the fear. That's going to get
Yeah.
I'm going to make a poster of that and put it on my desk.
Oh, I had it on my laptop. I had it on my screensaver. Feel the fear and do it anyway. It's the only way to do it.
Other questions? What do you look for when you choose a book to read?
Oh, golly. I don't know. I mean, sometimes obviously I might be drawn to a writer that I know I already love.
Who do you love?
Oh no, I shouldn't have said that because now I won't be able to think of anybody off the top of my head, which is so ridiculous.
I'm
I'm
sorry.
just scanning my shelves here. Oh, I like so many things. Isn't that dreadful that I'm not going to be able to think of
What
a
about
single
genre?
one?
Do you have a preferred genre?
I suppose I read a lot of literary fiction.
Mm-hmm.
And I enjoy a lot of literary fiction. I'm trying to think of something really standout that I've loved in the last year. Claire Keegan, the
Oh,
Irish writer, Foster, and Small Things Like These. I just
your
think,
book was compared quite favorably to Small Things Like These, which is a
well,
beautiful book.
it really is. And the way she writes is so sparse. There is not one gram of fat in her writing. And I just think it's it's a masterclass just reading her work. I think her work, and Foster, I think, is just one of the most tender, beautiful books that I've read. What a book I'm reading at the moment is before I was published or anything, which has only been a couple of weeks, I always noticed that writers would get gorgeous sort of advanced copies of other people's books. So that started to happen to me a little bit. So I'm reading a book that's out in April called The Midnight Carousel by Faiza Saeed McLean, and that is beautiful. And it's got a little magical element to it. And I do really love that, actually. I really enjoy that in stories. And I'm sorry, because I'm an avid reader, and of course I can't think of anybody.
Happens to the best of us, don't worry. How did you celebrate your publication date?
Oh, so I celebrated publication day by not writing. Giving myself a complete day off, and actually it was just very, very quiet. But a couple of days after, I had a small launch party with family and friends.
Nice.
And that was lovely.
Very nice. Any other questions? Maybe? All right. So do you think, let me ask a question, do you think you will follow in Claire Keegan's footsteps and have your book seen in other media, movies, television series?
Oh, well, I mean, it's the dream, isn't it?
Would that be?
Yeah, I would absolutely love that, of course. But I realize not every book is going to be made into a film. But, for me, when I was writing it, it felt very visual. And, I could imagine it as a film, but then I imagine almost every writer that writes something, would say the same thing. Yeah, that would be wonderful. And I'm still hoping, fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. It's a beautiful book. You will find
you.
yourself set back in time to scary Scotland. You will be immersed in this little village, and there is a cinematic quality to the book. You will just picture it entirely from start to finish, and these characters will, I think, be quite memorable for quite some time. I finished the book this morning, and it will be a long time before I stop thinking about Dorothy and Joseph and Moses and all of the ancillary characters as well. So thank you so much, Julia. This has been a delightful conversation. As all of the Mighty Blaze conversations are, again, you can find information about our upcoming shows at amightyblaze.com. Sign up for our newsletter there. You can always go to YouTube and find this interview as well as all of the other interviews by our wonderful hosts. I will be back next week, much sooner than usual, with Camilla Barnes, who is the author of The Usual Desire to Kill, Camilla is a playwright, and this is going to be her first novel. And it's been called an often hilarious and surprisingly moving portrait of a long married couple seen through the eyes of their wickedly observant daughter. And it's been plugged as a book for fans of a man called Ove and the Royal Tenenbaums, 2 books that I adored. So hope to see you next week, 2 p.m. April 3rd, Eastern Time. Until then, keep reading.